Hello, I'm Miranda Scanlon and I'm delighted to be able to present the Normal Birth Conference today. I'm going to talk to you about our research on the time of day that babies were born in different birth settings and how we involved and engaged maternity service users with our data linkage project. This work was done at City University of London, including the team that's mentioned on this slide and led by Alison Macfarlane. So who am I? Well, I've been coming to the Normal Birth Conference since it started in 2002, when my daughters shown here were somewhat smaller. You may remember Ms. Miranda Dodwell. For nearly 20 years, I ran the Birth Choice UK website, helping women choose where to have their baby. I've been passionate about women's choice of place in birth and experience of maternity care for a long time, and I've worked in maternity policy and research on this topic. This work was carried out as a senior research fellow at City University, and I'm currently the Executive Director of the Iolanthe Midwifery Trust, which is a fantastic charity giving grants to midwives and student midwives in the UK. This project that I'm talking to you about today is part of a larger study investigating how safe birth is for mothers and babies, depending on when that birth occurred, which time of day, day of the week, and time of year. So the project always intended to look at patterns in the time of day that babies were born, but because of my very particular interest in choice of place of birth, I realised that we could use this data to look at differences in those patterns according to where mothers gave birth. So briefly, this is how we did it. We had routinely collected maternity and birth data from England and Wales over a 10-year period, so that's from 2005 to 2014. And that amounted to 7 million birth records. It did feel a bit overwhelming at times. Obviously, we weren't using paper records, but nonetheless, it was a huge amount of data. And the nature of this information was that it was confidential, so that a lot of the work had to be carried out in a secure data lab. So for each of our 7 million birth records, we had to check that we had the time of day of birth, and we also needed to note the place that the birth happened, so an obstetric unit, a midwifery unit, or at home. We also had to note whether there was any kind of intervention, such as induction, and the mode of birth, whether by caesarean, assisted birth, or spontaneous. And once we had all that data, we could plot it on a graph. Now, this is the first of 4 graphs that I'm going to show you. And it's the pattern of all births over 24 hours. In fact, this is all singleton births in England and Wales in 3 different years, the 3 different lines. And that is for 2005, 2009, and 2014. And as you can see, the pattern is fairly consistent over 10 years. So fewer than average births in the early hours of the morning, and at its lowest between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m, and then rising to a peak mid-morning, falling again before lunchtime, a little further peak just after lunch, and then fewer births in the late afternoon and evening, and rising again into the night. And because the pattern is so similar for each of the 10 years, we actually are able to combine this data and look at it as a whole group. And that's what we've done on this graph. So each line is now all of the 10 years combined, but it's split into different birth settings. So you can see that the obstetric unit is in light blue, obstetric units with alongside midwifery-led units are in black, the freestanding midwifery units are in red, and home births are in green. And then the yellow line is all of the births combined. Unfortunately, we weren't able to separately identify births in AMUs alongside midwifery units, so they're included in the births with their corresponding obstetric unit. And you can see that these obstetric unit births show this pattern of these abrupt mid-morning peaks, whereas the home birth and freestanding midwifery unit births, that's the green and the red lines, show this more natural looking circadian rhythm. And we're going to look at that more closely on the next graph. So again, this is by time of day, and the home births are shown in green. And you can see this very regular wave-like pattern, with most of the births happening in the early hours of the morning, and a peak at about 4 o'clock in the morning. And then dropping throughout the day to a low about 12 hours later, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And this is a very consistent pattern. This is over 170,000 home births over 10 years. You can also see the purple line, that's new to this graph, and that's 2.5 million hospital births, but only those that began and ended spontaneously. So births without induction, cesarean, or instrumental assisted birth. And you can see that the pattern of that line is very similar to the home birth line, although less exaggerated. So there's less of a peak and a trough. The births are more evenly spaced, what we might call a flattened curve. And there's something interrupting that pattern before 6 o'clock and 9 o'clock in the morning. You can see there's a disruption to the curve there. And for completeness, I'm showing you this graph of no labour caesarean births across the hours of the day, and in fact here days of the week as well. So you can see Monday to Friday and Saturday and Sunday. And it's clear from this graph that it's the scheduling of elective caesareans which causes that mid-morning peak. So that was just a tiny part of the results from this study, but you might be prompted to ask some more questions about our research. Where does the data come from and how reliable is it? What do women having babies think about our research? Is it of any relevance or interest to them? It's a very data-intensive research project, and there are known challenges bridging the gap between data science and public views, illustrated very recently by the interpretation of the avalanche of COVID-19 data. So, and also, how can we interpret what we see in our research, and what are the implications of our results? And frankly, what should we do about them? So looking at the data and where it's come from, sorting that out wasn't as easy as you might think, because not only did we have 7 million birth records, but no single data set gives all of the information that we needed for our research. So we had to use data linkage techniques to link the 3 different routinely collected data sets. And I'm going to give you an overview of that here. So we started out with the birth registration data. So this is, say, for 2005. This is the data set that's collected when you register your baby's birth and you get the birth certificate. They also collect some other data at the same time. And because this is civil registration, it's actually the most complete data we have on births. However, the data on the time of day that a baby was born isn't in that data set. It's in the birth notification data set. And that's the data that's collected when a midwife notifies that a baby's been born and the baby receives its NHS number. And so we needed to link these 2 records using common data items. And you can see here that in 2005, we managed to, it was possible to link 645,000 records. But that didn't give us the clinical items. They're in a different data set. And for England, they're contained in the Hospital Episode Statistics data set, or the HARES data. And so we had to link to that data set as well. That gave us the induction and mode of delivery. And again, that was using common data items. As you can see, there are a fewer number of records linked there, and that's because of the less complete data set that makes up the HARES statistics. So you can see here that place of birth is recorded in each of those 3 data sets, and you might think that'd be jolly helpful. But unfortunately, each of those places of birth in the 3 data sets are coded differently. And therefore, we had to introduce a 4th data set, the Birth Choice UK Historic Maternity Unit database, which allowed us to interpret what those places of birth were using a unified code, and also to determine what type of birth setting they were. So of course, we not only had 2005 data, we had data for all 10 years, which is how we came up with our 7 million records. And all of those records had to be quality assured, which is a lot of work, but it did mean that we felt we could rely on our data. So what did women think of our research? And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the public involvement and engagement, or the PINE as we call it, of the project. And as I mentioned, there's a bit of an issue engaging the public in data-intensive research. And as you see, there were lots of complexities in the data that we used. And so we wanted to involve as many women as possible and find out their views. So firstly, we wanted to find out whether they found our use of their confidential maternity records acceptable. and also whether our research analyses were relevant to their experiences and concerns about using maternity services 24/7. To do this, we used an innovative 3-tiered approach, which started off with 2 service user researchers as project investigators. We recruited 4 PI&E members of the study advisory group, and we had around 100 maternity service users who were engaged through 4 regional workshops. And just to give you a little bit more information about tiers 1 and 2, which were the involvement side, I was involved as one of the service user researchers, and I worked with my colleague, my lovely colleague, Mary Newburn. And we worked together on this. We were part of the project team, and we'd been maternity service user representatives ourselves. And through our work with NCT and Birth Choice UK over long years, we had experience of facilitating groups, of listening to women's concerns and communicating research to them. And so as part of our role, we coordinated the public engagement side of the research and essentially bridged the gap between the public views and the data scientists, acting as knowledge intermediaries. As I said, we also recruited 4 PI&E members of the study advisory group. These were Eleanor Malloy, Debbie Chippington-Derrick, Kate Bedding, and Helen Castledine. And they had valuable service user experience in clinical maternity settings as members of groups representing women's interests. Their wide-ranging knowledge and perspective contributed to the strategic development of the project. We are painfully aware that there was a lack of diversity in our involvement strategy, which would be addressed if we were recruiting today. And then moving on to our engagement, the tier 3, as I said, we had 4 regional workshops. One of these was with a diverse inner city group. And this allowed us to engage with a larger group of maternity service representatives, tell them about our research and findings, and to find out about their experiences and concerns, particularly about out-of-hours care and staffing levels. Their input ensured that our research stayed relevant to their needs. And this shows one of our workshops, which took place in Wakefield in Yorkshire. And you can see the women taking part in small group work, writing on flip charts, putting down their ideas, which were then fed back to a larger group. And so women's views, they were very comfortable with our use of confidential data, which was very reassuring for us. And as part of the engagement process, we showed them the graphs that I've shown you, and women were intrigued by the patterns of birth. They connected with their own experiences, and we were able to help them understand the limitations of our data and what we could discover. And they discussed what reasons there might be for this flattened curve for women having normal births in hospitals. I mean, our data can't tell you what's happening, but we can speculate. And the women discussed whether there was an effect of environment or culture, routine, management, or other interruptions to the normal physiology of labour. And especially in that morning period, the end of the night shift perhaps and the start of the day shift, why would that have an effect on labouring women? As I said, our data can't tell us that, and further research will be needed. And then my question here, final question is, does it matter? So, does it matter if patterns of birth are affected by institutional settings? Well, for our women, they were very clear. They said yes. So our engaged service users were clear that commissioners and healthcare professionals would benefit from an understanding of the impact that institutional settings might have on the timing of birth compared with being at home, and that they should consider critically issues such as levels of lighting, degree of privacy allowed women, and the sense of intimacy that could be created in different settings. And to me, if it matters to women, then it should matter to researchers and midwives too. This is really important work. So we've written up our work. We were recently published writing about involving service users in our research. That was published recently in the International Journal of Population Data Science. And you can also read the full report of our work published by the NIHR, and the links are there. Thank you very much for listening. It's been a pleasure to present to you.